Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Iván Duque, former President of Colombia, and Dr. Andrew Steer, President and CEO of Bezos Earth Fund.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is not one person asking the other person questions. It's us having a conversation together. And it's a great honor to be with you, President Duque.
Same, Andrew. It's a great honor for me to be here with you.
Let's begin with asking you about your tenure and what you did for nature and climate, because it was quite remarkable what you did, actually. I don't think there's any government anywhere that has managed to increase protected areas the way you did. Not many heads of state have written books on climate change. So how did that happen? What motivated you? And not easy. I'm sure that not everybody loved it. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I think it's a life passion. So as we have discussed it in multiple ways, I was raised in a family where the conversation about nature and the protection of the environment was present. And throughout my career, when I was working at the Ministry of Finance in Colombia or at the IDB or in the Senate or even academia, the conversation about climate change for me was crucial. And I remember that when I was in office, I said to my team, which are the bold things that we can do on the environment? And energy transition was there, and we did something very important there, passing from 0.2% of non-conventional renewables to almost 15%. But on protected areas, which was a dream that I had, how could we reach that goal of 30 by 30 that Colombia had committed in my administration? And I remember when we came out from the pandemic, I called Minister Carlos Correa, who might be here in the room, and I said, Carlos, we have to accelerate this. And we were at 13%. So he said, yes, Mr. President, we're certainly going to do it by 2030. And I said, no, we have to do it by 2022. So he was really shocked. But we were able to call academia, and we were able to call the science community and said, how can we do it? And they said, well, we have to do all these revisions of land. We have to do all this monitoring. And what was very nice, Andrew, is that we were able to put Colombia as one of the first countries in Latin America to get to more than 30% of its territory declared a protected area in 2022 with the help of the scientific community, academia, and international organizations, including your support with the Bezos Earth Fund. So Colombia became a reference model, and today part of the work that I do is go around the world. We go do a lot of things together, you and I and the team of the Bezos Earth Fund, in order to get other heads of state to assume the same responsibility. And I can tell everybody here in this room, if we get more heads of state to take this personal and make 30 before 30 a priority, we will certainly give more inspiration, not only at the global south level, but also to the global north. So I feel very proud about that.
Well, you certainly should. For those of you that don't know about 30 by 30, it was an idea. I mean, at one level, politically, you can get your head around it very quickly. 30% of land and sea to be protected by 2030. 3 years ago, maybe 20 countries had said, oh, we'd be interested in doing that. And we all worked very hard, people in this room included, and we got it up to like 110 countries said, yeah, we're in. And then amazingly, at the Biodiversity Convention meeting last year in Montreal, it became universally accepted. And that's very, very important. And it was a few politicians, a few like yourself, that said to others, hey, this can really work. And you demonstrated that actually it was good for your people. It wasn't just a morally right thing to do, but it was actually good for your people.
I remember that one of the toughest conversations was on maritime protected areas, because definitely we're doing a big expansion, and we were able to work with President Lasso from Ecuador, with President Cortizo from Panama, and President Alvarado from Costa Rica to create this unified protected area, obviously within our sovereignty, but extended. And it became the largest maritime protected area in the planet. And we worked to have a great amount of that territory as a no-take territory. And I remember the fisheries were very anxious, and I said to them, well, you have to acknowledge that this is not fenced. If you allow this to be a protected area, if you allow the species to grow, and you're not letting big fisheries come and take the baby fish, to put it in a graphical way, you will allow to have more sustainable fishing years down the road, months down the road. So that level of persuasion took longer, and then something that we identified is when you declare a maritime protected area, the economy of scuba diving tourism started to look with a lot of interest, and then they understood that if they were part of the services offered to that sector of the economy, their earnings was going to be 5, 6, and even 10 times larger than that they had in the past. So that was a very nice instrument. But now let me turn to you, Andrew.
Well, no, just to finish on that story, because it's such a good story. So I'm sure some of you were in the Glasgow COP26 2 years ago, and you and the other 3 heads of state from this grouping, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, and led by Colombia, you made an announcement. We're going to do this. And it was incredibly interesting, sort of asking them, so ask the president of Ecuador, how did you get your fishing industry on board? Well, difficult. And you then talk to how you each did it, sharing ideas. And it's a fascinating sort of story about how things can happen quickly if you have the right leadership and you have that kind of upward spiral of, my goodness me, they're doing it, I want to be part of that. And then, of course, you need finance. And everybody says, oh, there's not enough money to finance all this. Well, it turns out, if you have the right kind of leadership and you're willing to put some of your own money in, and you did a deal, right, we're going to put 50% from your own government coffers. If the others could come in, we at the Bezos Earth Fund came right in, sat with your guys and sat with the other 3, and you convened everybody together, put a financial plan together, and it's now up and running, even although, of course, governments have changed.
But also more important that just making the decision, which was bold and required resources, was to assume a moral responsibility. Colombia barely represents 0.6% of all the global emissions, but we're one of the most threatened countries by the effects of climate change. And we set the goal of reducing our NDCs by 51% towards 2030, which is higher than many countries in the global north. And we said, okay, if we're doing this, what's the story behind it? If a country like Colombia that only represents 0.6% of the global emissions makes this kind of endeavor, then it gives a moral responsibility also to the global north. And I think, for example, that you see now prime ministers like John Briceño in Belize saying, I want to get to 30 by 26, and you're seeing other countries in South America that want to embrace this cause, as for example, President Santiago Peña from Paraguay, that you will hear from him here, has also said, we want to move forward. You get more heads of state knowing that what makes the difference is making this issue a presidential issue. And we feel very happy that we're able to organize the Climate Action Cabinet, in which all this allowed all the sectors to participate in their efforts. Yes. But I need to ask you something, Andrew. You have a tremendous background. You came as, before you became the CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. You were leading WRI. You were special envoy of the World Bank on climate throughout the world. You were also in development finance in the UK. You have a great interaction with the private sector. But you made a very bold decision of creating something big on environmental philanthropy. And I really want to know what's your take on what's the current role of environmental philanthropy in the world, and how can environmental philanthropy leverage the possibility of getting things done sooner?
Yeah, wow. Well, these are interesting times, aren't they? And no individual group, whether it's government, private sector, NGOs, or certainly philanthropy, can solve it on there. The whole point is it's a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? And we need the different pieces, and each player needs to play a different role. And it's a huge privilege, obviously, to have the opportunity to work the Bezos Earth Fund. Jeff Bezos, as you may know, put $10 billion aside to be allocated as grants this decisive decade. So by 2030, that's when the SDGs are due to be delivered. And so we're privileged to be in nature and climate, probably the biggest fund philanthropically that's ever been created for that purpose. So then the question is, how do you do business? Well, first you have to know, what's philanthropy good at? Philanthropy is good at making decisions quickly, at being able to take risks, knowing sometimes that things will fail. We're able to basically convene as well as allocate money. And we have freedom really to operate in any way we want. And that enables one to get in the mix very quickly without huge sort of layers of committees and regulations and so on. And this is a great privilege. The way we do business is we say what needs to be done this decade and the next. And it turns out there's about 50 transitions that are required. Sounds like a lot, but actually that includes getting rid of the internal combustion engine, for example. It includes developing the hydrogen economy. It includes, reducing food loss and waste by 50% this decade. So there's about 50 of them. We monitor those in something called the System Change Lab, which we do together with the World Resources Institute and some other scientific organizations. And we ask the question, of these 50, how are they doing? How close are they to a tipping point that is positive? So we look at costs, we look at political, we look at behavioral issues, and we say, what would it take to accelerate the path to those tipping points so that change becomes irresistible and unstoppable? And then we say, is there a role for us in philanthropy that could really get that kind of leverage? And so, for example, we're able to, when we see something like what you did with your colleagues, it's actually very easy for us to say, my goodness me, we come in with relatively modest amounts of money, and we're going to demonstrate not only for these 4 amazing countries, especially Colombia, but actually that's going to be a model for others to follow. So, for example, this week we're meeting with some of the heads of state of the Pacific Islands, saying, well, would it be possible to have some kind of equivalent type of relationship that for your group of countries on marine protected areas? That'd be just one example, but there are many, many examples where we would do is look at a situation, for example, landscape restoration in Africa. So we work on something with the African Union called Africa 100. 100 million hectares of land to be restored in Africa by 2030. What's our role? Well, in that particular case, our role is injecting funds that will be catalytic to help bring private funds in and other government funds, working with other donors. It's to invest in monitoring, so satellite technology. We put $60 million in a satellite system that will not only see every tree falling, but it will now for the first time ever be able to see trees growing, and you'll be able to see also how much carbon is embedded in those trees. And my goodness me, then you can start talking about carbon markets down the road as well. So what we try and do, both on the climate side and the nature side, and of course they're totally linked, we try to identify where are those neuralgic points, where are those barriers that with the right kind of money, boldly put, with the right kind of convening, with the right kind of political engagement, we can move forward. And that's why it's a privilege working with you, because President Duque is now using his post-presidential life to really win over political support and technical support for these much, much needed changes.
So one issue that I think many of the people who are here in the room have been trying to work on is, how do you finance this? And let me put maybe another complexity. Most of the countries in the world are highly indebted. Mm-hmm. You have a great experience in development finance, and you know the fiscal spaces are quite limited, but everybody needs to make big expenses in order to meet the NDCs in the next 7 years. Mm-hmm. So which are the mechanisms in order to trigger that mobilization of capital? We've seen, for example, the aspiration in Africa to have an Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. We've seen that now there are countries like Kenya, Malawi, Botswana, among many others, saying, okay, we want to make this possible. But there's something that is needed, and it's not the demand, because there are buyers willing to say, I will use carbon credits to buy from the countries and maybe trigger a massive mobilization of capital. The great challenge is in the supply in order to have highly integral carbon credit markets, and you have put a lot of effort in this. And I just want to pick your brains. What's your take on how to create those carbon credits with the level of trust and integrity that you think the world is expecting from the Bezos Search Fund perspective?
Well, I mean, we're in a much better place than we were, partly because of technology. I mean, we now literally can see on the nature side of things, we can see land use change week by week down to 10 meters by 10 meters, and we actually can figure out how much carbon is embedded in that. We couldn't do that 5 years ago, and so we're in a much better state than we were. Carbon markets, as you know very well, President Duque, have had ups and downs. They started with great fanfare 30 years ago. I was actually running a part of the World Bank then that set up the first pilot programs, and it was incredibly exciting and really great projects. But actually it turned out that because there was not very good monitoring, we didn't really know how to monitor, sort of it went up, but then we went down into the valley of despair. We lost 10 years really, where prices were very low because the businesses didn't want to put money in because they thought no one would trust it, and the supply was very weak, as you say. So now we're in a much, much better position. And you and I were together 10 days ago in Nairobi at the Africa Climate Summit, and it was fantastic. And I know you're an advisor to what's called the African Climate Carbon Markets Initiative, where Africa is saying, wait a minute, you know, carbon markets tend not to come to Africa enough. And so they're setting up a really wonderful organization looking at high quality supply, high quality demand. We also run something else with the State Department in the United States and with the Rockefeller Foundation called the Energy Transition Accelerator, the purpose of which is to really try and mobilize serious amounts of money in the billions of dollars to support the energy transition. So we've got, and I know I've heard you speak on this, President Duque, so you would say this better than I. We've got a little too nervous about carbon markets. And we need to embrace them more. Yes, we need very high quality on supply, very high quality on demand. We actually now know how to do that. The problem is everybody is sort of dancing around the edge, and we need to sort of embrace and dance together, so to speak. So I'm encouraged, but we do need to move things forward more rapidly. And I'll give you an example of something that's very much on our mind at the moment. You may have heard of the so-called JETPs. Those are Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And the G7 did deals with South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and now doing some more. And they're really wonderful political agreements. So I was in Vietnam like 4 months ago. The government of Vietnam is having to increase its electricity supply by about 6% a year. They're very good at building coal-powered plants. But actually, they've now agreed to stop doing that. And the G7 has said, okay, we'll put in $17 billion, half of it public, half of it private. Sounds wonderful. Turns out, actually, that money is a bit squishy. Yeah. And actually, it requires all kinds of perfect policy changes on the part of the Vietnamese government. What they're desperately short of is sort of grant-like money. Carbon markets can do what bilateral donors are not doing at the moment,
and let me add something there, because I think we have many people in the audience who have been in the energy sector, and I think there's a very strong statement in the case of energy transition. There's no transition without transmission, and there's no transmission without a market. And I'm very worried about the demagoguery and populism that I'm seeing in many countries in the global south, where presidents just want to interfere to set an artificial price for energy that will derail any interest from the private sector to actively invest and help the market expand. Without a market, there's not going to be the investment in this technology, there's not going to be the transmission, so the transition is going to be much slower than everybody expects. Now, how can you intervene in a way to fix the market failures? I think in many developing countries, you need to create, especially auction systems of two edges, like the ones we had in Colombia, where you had the buyers and the sellers, and we were able to pass from literally 50 megawatts of installed capacity of non-conventional renewables to get 4,000 megawatts to be installed over time. So by saying that, my question is also, how do you think you get through philanthropy to get the governments to do more market-driven solutions and not pretend that father state is going to do everything, because that per se a failure itself?
Well, of course, the great thing about philanthropy is you can go into research on technology, but you can also go into policy work and political lobbying. And one of the things we do here in this country is engage at the policy level and on the hearts and minds and try and shift things. Philanthropy played quite an important role in the arrival of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act last year. And so it's incredibly important what you just said, that we honor the power of markets. It would be great if we could have a global price on carbon, wouldn't it? Well, we're a long way away from that. In the meantime, we have to do things that sort of mimic the effect of that, so to speak. But it's terribly important that we understand that the private sector and the initiative thereof will be what drives things. So governments have a huge role, but the private sector is the one that needs to respond to a friendly environment, so to speak. And I mean, let me say a word about Concordia, because I think the kind of convenings that Concordia does, precisely bringing all the different players to the table, is exactly what's needed. But let me turn the tables on you now. We have 1 minute and 13 seconds to go. We've just been instructed.
You remind me of a political debate.
Yeah, then they're going to have the advertisements are coming after, the commercials. We're heading up to COP28. How are you feeling?
Well, I believe that there is a big opportunity. And I think it's a bigger opportunity than the one we had in Sharm el-Sheikh, which was more of a transition inside all the geopolitical complexities. I think this has to be a COP of great leadership by the Global South. And by that I mean you have the superpowers of biodiversity, because the Global South has the superpowers of biodiversity, talking to the Global North. And there's no way we're going to get to carbon neutrality without those superpowers of biodiversity. And we're talking about 3 very important hotspots in the planet: the Amazon, the Congo Basin, Southeast Asia. And you have to embrace the value of carbon neutrality. We all do. But nature positive needs to be a strong part of the conversation in COP.
Amen.
Because there's a lot of pledges, and as I say, well, the good thing about COPs is that every year you go, you get the same pledge based on the money that was pledged the year before, and the year before, and the year before. Yeah. So it's always the same money in many of the bilateral donors' announcements. I think today we really have to get a clear commitment out of what was approved in Montreal to at least have the first 20 billion of mobilization throughout the Global South from bilateral donors to protect these areas. And also, Andrew, market-driven, nature-based solutions. Carbon credits have a debate per se, but I think as much as you increase the integrity and the scrutiny and the preparation of projects, you'll do things much better. But we need to get something out of COP, which is how are we going to make possible the first effective biodiversity credits?
Wow, that's
because
great.
In my opinion, it's the only way to get to that 30 by 30. And I'll maybe say this in the time that we have.
Well, you notice as you've been talking, actually, it must be a good answer, because the 2 minutes was added.
I get time rebates. I get time rebates in Concordia. Yeah. Concordia gives me times rebates once in a while. So let me finish by saying this. The role of philanthropy, in my opinion, in this, is that philanthropy has been able to show some of the governments that you can mobilize resources faster, effective, and with impact.
Right.
And my great objective as a participant in many of these conversations in COP is how are we going to get the most stronger commitment ever made to mobilize the resources to protect those basins and really show that carbon neutrality is not possible without nature positive.
So that's a perfect way to end. Look, I mean, it's so easy, isn't it, to get depressed at the moment. We just had the Stocktake report, which says we're way off track on the Paris deal. Very easy to think, let's give up on the 1.5 degrees. It's too difficult. And a good excuse for us all to sit back. It turns out that actually there's a huge amount to be hopeful about. We're sponsoring something called the Groundswell Initiative, trying to get a groundswell around a recognition that there are amazing positive tipping points in our near-term future. If you look at renewable energy, for example, we've already crossed a tipping point. Look at electric vehicles, small vehicles. We're really crossing that tipping point. Still needs to be accelerated, but that's exactly what is happening. Now, there are a number of others, like the hydrogen economy, where we haven't crossed that tipping point. But if you look at the cost of an electrolyzer, which is the big cost, it's down by 70% of what it needs to be down by before you get that tipping point crossed, just in the last decade, so to speak. So what we're trying to do is show these, what in the United States are called hockey sticks, in your future, and how do we bring them about quickly, so that we go to COP28 with a sense of can do. For heaven's sake, it is not too late, but we do need to pull our socks up. And that's
Andrew,
exactly what you've done in your career, and it is a huge joy to talk to you, President Duque. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great.
It has been a great pleasure. Thank you.